Wonderful. Thank you all. Again, my name is Patrick Doherty. I'm the director of the Smart Strategy Initiative here at the New America Foundation, and I work with Peter and Steve here as a senior advisor to the Counterterrorism Program and the National Security Studies Program. And what we decided to do when we were designing this conference was to get the broad overview and then drill down into various theaters. And we're going to start with the domestic theater and really take a look at the changing nature of the domestic threat and our domestic responses to it, and also look at our vulnerabilities. About a year ago, senior national security aide Dennis McDonough was speaking to another New America audience at the release of the national security strategy of the United States, President Obama's first. And he commented on and gave his perspective on the domestic threat. He said, the threat is from onesies and twosies, he called it, right? That get past our defenses and strike our vulnerabilities. And so really that's what we're going to look at. We're going to look at what are the onesies and twosies that are going to get through. I think they're very realistic based on our last conversation, that it's not about big either 9/11 style or worse mushroom cloud type attacks. And they're looking very realistically at what the likely threat is. But what is that threat? And so what we're going to do is start off with Karen Greenberg, a longtime friend of New America, Peter Bergen, myself here, and a longtime collaborator in these conferences. And Karen's going to give us the broad overview of the domestic threat. And then we've asked Peter Neumann to look at this dynamic that we started talking about in the last panel, internet radicalization, and the countermeasures, counter-radicalization, both on the internet side and more generally. And then we're really pleased to have Juliette Kayyem speak today. She's just finished, 5 years of continuous service, first for Governor Deval Patrick as Homeland Security Advisor in Massachusetts, and then just recently as Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security for Intergovernmental Affairs. And she's going to take a look at Homeland Security in the context of a changing threat and changing budgets. Where do we stand in terms of the Homeland Security enterprise? And then finally, we're going to close with our own Barry Lynn, who directs now I always forget the name of the program. It's the Markets, Enterprise, and Resiliency Initiative. And Barry brings an incredible understanding of private sector supply chains and economic networks. And many of you are going to recognize how important and relevant this is, given Al-Qaeda and the Arabian Peninsula's attempted attack last year on global shipping, on FedEx and UPS. What could that have done if the attacks were successful? And looking at some of the vulnerabilities that are still out there. We don't talk about them much in recent years, but they're still considerable. We've got a lot of concentration of and single supply chains out there, and we're going to take a look at that. So that's the overview. I'm going to ask all the speakers to come up to the panel. And one more, if you turned on your phone, if you could turn it back off, that'd be great, so it doesn't interfere with the microphones. And we're going to start with Karen.
Thanks, Patrick. Thanks, Peter, for having me and for doing this. So I'm just going to correct a little bit about what I'm going to talk about. So the reason I was asked to speak, other than liking the New America Foundation more than anyone else in New York, perhaps, is that I run my center, the Center on Law and Security, has a database that we've been filling for 8 years, pretty much 24/7, which looks into all of the terrorism trials from charge to result since 9/11. And what we thought initially about this terrorism trial database, which is what it's called, was that we would look at the track record of the Department of Justice. It sort of started in a kind of contrarian way, like you're arresting all these guys, how many of them are really licensed fraud, it had that tone to it in 2003, 2004, 2005. But around the middle of the 2000s, we realized that we had the opportunity to know a lot more from this database, and largely this was encouraged by Peter, who thought we might want to look into the criminal complaints and attend some of the trials and get to know some of the individuals. Now, just so you know, there are 1,000 trials, so I don't really want to go to 1,000 trials. Luckily, most of them plead. But we have a vast amount of information about who these people are. So when I'm asked to speak about the terrorism threat, I'm always a little cautious. I want just a word of caution to myself and then to you derivatively, which is that this is the perceived threat. This is the people we arrest, our government arrests. These are the people that we indict. And these are the people that we bring to justice one way or another. So at some point in the future, when we have the luxury of being historians, maybe we can say, this is who we thought, and this is what we thought about the threat. But it doesn't mean that what's coming up through our trials is the exact threat. And one of the things I was struck by in the first panel was there are some disconnects between how al-Qaeda, et cetera, LET, are viewed globally as a threat and how they emerge in the database. So I'm just going to talk very briefly, actually, about some of the statistics and what I think is going on. And I think you probably know this, but I'll go through it for you anyway. There have been 308 cases of jihadi terrorism, and those are individuals, not cases, since 9/11. Of those 308, a third that we know of are al-Qaeda. Now, it could always emerge, later that there were more al-Qaeda. A tenth of them are al-Shabaab, and not even a handful of them are LET. And, it's doubled in size from these indictments yesterday. However, there are some, the way to look at these statistics is to understand, and I don't know if anybody mentioned this earlier, that since 2009, since Obama took office, the rate, the seriousness, and the degree of danger involved in terrorism arrests and the number of indictments has escalated dramatically. There have been, and you can compare this with the numbers I just gave, 55 indictments in 2010 alone. And I thought I would, but keep in mind my original caveat, about how this is our perceived threat. I'd try to explain that rise in numbers to you and see how it plays out. The first thing I want to mention is the FBI stings. And even though they may be the least important in terms of assessing the threat, they contribute significantly to the numbers. So they're 20% of these cases. And the way an FBI sting works, as you may or might not know, depends on who you're talking to. The way an FBI sting works is that the FBI is charged to determine who might want to commit a crime, as opposed to who's already involved in a crime. The informant cases really the FBI has been involved with them since the beginning. And I'm going to come back to these. So that's one of the reasons the rates have gone up astronomically. But if you take that out, you still have 45 individuals, and it's still a high number. The most serious attempts, as I said, since 2009, since 2001 have been since 2009, and you know them all. They are Hassan, Abdulmutallab, Zazi, Shahzad, and David Headley, whom I'm assuming somebody will talk about after me. And if not, you can ask questions about it. These are al-Qaeda and Pakistani-based terrorist groups cases. They are not al-Shabaab cases. They involve individuals who's had significant, for the most part, involvement with other countries, either by growing up there or having family there. I sort of take Abdulmutallab out of it because he's a one-off in terms of talking about the domestic threat here. But he is part of the escalation. And so even though the number 55 is rather large, it's much more important, these 5 cases, than the 55, which is a reason not to look just at numbers. And we can talk later about what's significant about these cases. Somebody mentioned WMDs before. I think Steve Cole, where were the WMDs, or someone did. More and more of the domestic prosecutions include WMD charges. This was not true for the first 6 years of terrorism prosecutions in the United States. I can't remember what year it was, but I remember that after something like the first 4 years, there was one WMD charge that stood up. Now there are a lot. Now, in part, again, you have to be careful because FBI cases involve WMD charges. They specifically involve themselves in plots which include WMDs because that's the charge they want. Having said that, in these other cases that I mentioned, with the exception of Hazan, involved WMDs. So they are on the rise, and it's one of the reasons that the Bureau wants to participate in plots that look like this. The final reason, and statistically, in terms of understanding what these cases, the rising cases are, is what I'm sure you know, and I'm sure somebody's going to talk about from the list of participants I saw, which are the Somalians. The number of Somalians that have been arrested, last year alone, I believe, was people involved in Somali terrorism were 25. And half of them were Somali, I believe, and half were American. And I think the case that everybody's focused on is Zachary Chesser, because it was a case of an American who was not a Somalian who got caught up in the rhetoric of what was happening in Somalia. He was arrested before he went abroad, I think the day before the terrorist attack in Uganda. And he is providing a lot of information in the hopes of reduction of his sentence. But these are the three big things that are happening. I think in terms of understanding the threat, there's really two things to look at. One is the role of, and this is almost like old Al-Qaeda. It's like the first Al-Qaeda conference we had, which was what's the nationalist threat that's involved in these plots? So it was about Kashmir. It was about other things that have fit in, but it was very nationalist-centric. That's what's happening with Somalia, and I guess the question for us and for law enforcement is, what will it mean down the road if these people return? Because they're getting training. They're going, for the most part, they're going to be killed. That's how it seems. But they are getting training, and they will come back. So the Somalia population, from the point of view of law enforcement, is something that I think Americans are attuned to, need to be attuned to, and have a better sense, here's the good news, of how to infiltrate these communities than we've had with some of the other communities. I think the one thing I really worry about in understanding these cases, and I think I said this in the beginning, and I just want to reiterate it, is the degree to which the FBI informant work can skew the statistics and make us think that we have one threat where we have another threat. And I think it's something that somebody who likes to look at these things, maybe us or maybe somebody else, should look at. And so I wanted to take this moment to just talk about two different strategies in terms of law enforcement and what's going on in informant cases. And I'm going to do it very briefly and then close with some questions. I'm sure you know about the JFK plot. It was just a plot to blow up fuel lines at John F. Kennedy Airport, which was an informant case, which was a poorly argued court case on the point of view of the defense. What came out on this case was actually one of the more interesting things that's come out in any of the cases that we've looked at. What came out was that this sort of bumbling fool, he was kind of a bumbling fool, jazz musician who had some idea about jihad, who the defense argued couldn't hold a camera and therefore couldn't surveil, actually was led in the course of this sting to get in touch with people in Guyana and in Trinidad. And the ultimate narrative of this sting tied to Shukrajuma, and I don't have to explain to you in the room that Shukrajuma is the most unnamed, unknown, unrecognized potential threat to the United States outside of the United States. We all talk about Al-Awlaki, but really it's not just Al-Awlaki. It's Al-Awlaki and Shukrajuma, and I'm hoping that that's something that law enforcement is on top of. But that's an example of a sting where it actually takes you to understand better what the threat was. And what emerged from that case, in a rather convincing way, was a tie between Iran, the Caribbean, and the United States. And it changed the nature of understanding the threat. And I would compare that to a lot of other cases. Most recently, the Cromedy case about 4 African Americans who are literally lured into attacking a synagogue, mostly at, or if not entirely, at the suggestion of the Bureau. And so I think what I'm trying to say is that the stings, they skew the statistics, but done right, they can be very important. And so you want to make sure they're not going overboard, and so therefore we don't really understand what the threat is. Having said that, I want to turn to what I think the questions that need to be addressed to this database are going forward. One of them I just referred to. Don't kid yourself about the Americans abroad. These kids, whether it's the 5 that I mentioned or the Somalis or even some of the FBI people, are using the internet and they are trying to reach out to Alaki, and in some cases they are reaching out to Alaki. The role of Shukra Juma is something that law enforcement probably is much more on top of than I have a sense of, but he creeps up in case after case after case as a much more significant constant than either membership in Al-Qaeda or one of the Pakistani groups, and certainly of Shabab. And it's, you know, that's where the circles are starting to coalesce. You know, one of the things you're always worried about is, you know, where's going to be the interchange between jihadi groups with different ostensible home bases. Well, the internet is the place where they can exchange, and the Americans abroad who are participating in this are the people that can do it. So I just wanted to mention that. The second thing is, and it sort of came up a little bit this morning, is the intergenerational notion of this. You know, Peter's done this wonderful job of Al-Qaeda 1.0, 2.0, 3, what are we, 3.0, 4, whatever. The point is that if you look at these cases and you look at what's happening, there is actually a significant difference between the first Al-Qaeda, whatever you want to call it, and what's happening now. And I'd love to know more about that conversation from the point of view of Al-Qaeda 1.0 and even Al-Qaeda 2.0, and largely in terms of use of weapons. I'm not so sure WMDs are going to be the weapons of the future. I'm not so sure that the Hassan case isn't an example. And I'm not so sure that Americans abroad who are talking about this, Alaki, aren't beginning to think about the gun issue and how to use guns. And I don't want to scare anybody, so I think I'll be quiet. But, you know, we're the kind of, at the center, we're often saying, don't be worried. You know, the fear is over-exaggerated. Our leadership doesn't understand it. I think for the most part, that is correct. I think that the numbers make it seem like there are many more people involved, and that there are and that there are threats everywhere. What really emerges from these what's happened in the past 2 years is that there are much more serious abilities on the part of people who want to harm us, that our law enforcement seems to be more on top of a lot of it. But that I think maybe it was Bruce Hoffman said earlier, is really true. Until we learn to distinguish between different kinds of arrests and different kinds of threats and different kinds of threat levels, we're not going to be able to address some of the nuances that are actually what this threat is all about. So I think I exceeded my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. And let me quickly amend and revise my my introduction for Peter, since I just kind of quickly glossed over his credentials. He's the director of the International Center for the Study of Radicalization and Political Violence. He's currently at the on sabbatical at Georgetown University, and working with Peter and a number of our other colleagues on working on the Kane and Hamilton Study Commission coming up, and we're glad to have him here. And he's going to talk about counter-radicalization. Thank you, Peter.
Well, good morning, and thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much, Patrick, for the invitation. I'm going to speak a little bit about online radicalization, but I think it's worth talking a little bit more generally about counter-radicalization and what it entails, because that is something that I've been working on now for a number of months, and I think it's a very important topic, not least because the administration itself is very soon going to come out with a policy statement on counter-radicalization. So this isn't just an abstract exercise. Counter-radicalization is coming to the shores, so we better think about what it is and how it should be done. The first question I want to answer, if this works, maybe not, is what is counter-radicalization? And the second one is, why do we need it? The first question is, I believe, even the more important one. I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about this because I have found not that people are necessarily stupid and they don't understand what it is, but I found that there are a lot of disagreements about the concept, and that it is really worth educating both experts and the public about the meaning of counter-radicalization. Let me first of all begin by saying what it is not. The first thing that it is not community policing. When I hear Secretary Napolitano speak, quite often, when she talks about countering violent extremism and counter-radicalization, all she talks about is community policing. It's training police forces, it is educating law enforcement. And she essentially conceives of counter-radicalization as a softer, nicer, more cuddly form of counter-terrorism. Counter-terrorism with a friendly face. Essentially still is about policing, it's about finding terrorists, thwarting plots, it's about developing relationships with communities so they can give you tips so you can arrest terrorists. But that is a minor function of counter-radicalization. It is not at the heart of the concept. Furthermore, counter-radicalization is not de-radicalization. It mustn't be confused with that. We've had, and you've probably all heard about, mostly prison-based counter-radicalization, de-radicalization programs in places like Saudi, Iraq, Indonesia. These de-radicalization programs, or better, rehabilitation programs, deal with jihadists, former members, activists, strong sympathizers of terrorist groups who've been arrested, who are now being reformed. The audience of de-radicalization programs are radicalized people. The audience of counter-rad programs are non-radicalized people, who, however, may be targeted by radicalized people for the purpose of radicalization and recruitment. And that's a really, really important difference. There are two different audiences. Counter-radicalization is not directed at people who are already terrorists, but the audience for counter-radicalization are communities that may be targeted by terrorists. And that brings us to the heart of the matter, namely that counter-rad is about radicalization prevention. The aim is prevention. It's about raising awareness, inoculating communities against the appeal of violent extremism, empowering them to stand up against it. That's what counter-radicalization is about. It's about empowering people to challenge the ideas and the individuals that are spreading violent extremism. And that, incidentally, is why it can't be coercive. That's why it can't be primarily or even predominantly about policing. Because you're not dealing with terrorists, you're not even dealing with potential terrorists. That's why it's so terrible, I think, when policymakers only talk about counter-radicalization as a soft form of policing, because it isn't. Because that creates an entirely wrong perception that inadvertently actually feeds into the whole Pete King idea that all Muslims are radicalized and that they need to be spied upon. Counter-rad is not a spying program, at least not when it's properly understood. It's not a policing program. Rather than reining in those unruly Muslims, it's about strengthening communities, it's about empowering, educating them, sometimes in partnership with the government, but ideally so they can help themselves. What does counter-radicalization consist of? It's a policy theme, not a single policy. It's delivered and implemented through a multitude of channels and programs. They can come in different forms and shapes. It may be standalone activities, roundtables, say, on the issue of counter-radicalization, but more often than not, it is actually embedded within existing government programs, for example, community safety challenges, provision of good governance. Certain situations, the government is actually limited to the role of convening relevant parties so that networks and partnerships between non-governmental actors can be forged. All these things are counter-radicalization. Typical activities, it can include all sorts of things, but typical activities are messaging, outreach, capacity building, and training and education. That's what counter-radicalization is. It's none of the things that I mentioned at the beginning. Now the question is, do we really need this? Now, again, it's very difficult to talk about radicalization in this country. Never mind counter-radicalization. That's because all these terms have been negatively framed in many ways. And that's because of the hearings which portrayed all Muslims in this country as extremists or extremist sympathizers. That's because senior policymakers constantly talk about policing. And for those who've dived a little bit deeper into the debate, there's, of course, the British Prevent Programme, the most extensive counter-rad program in the Western world, which in many respects was not very successful and which fell precisely into the trap of securitizing Muslim communities. And based on all these impressions, people, especially those of more liberal bent, then conclude that counter-rad is a terrible idea. It's about criminalizing thought. It's very un-American. And I believe there is another way. So what I would ask you to do for just 1 second is to forget all of these things, erase them from your mind, and keep an open mind about what I'm going to tell you now. So let's imagine we have a person, a young person who, for whatever reason, is attracted to jihadist ideas, spends a lot of time exploring those ideas on the internet. He gets involved in chat rooms. He starts becoming what Jared Bratman calls a jihobbyist. He connects to people. He starts spending most of his life in this kind of virtual world. Now, these are legal activities. They're protected by the Constitution. Indeed, there's no guarantee that this person will ever turn to illegal activities, that this person will become a terrorist. In fact, there's a greater chance still that he will not become a terrorist than there is that he will become a terrorist. Now, in this country right now, there are two choices of what you can do with this person. The first choice is what civil libertarians are arguing, which is do nothing, right? He's engaging in constitutionally protected ideas. This should be of no concern to anyone. What he's doing is legal. The other option is the FBI option, the entrapment option. So they are seeing someone like that, and they are saying, well, right now, he's only talking about illegal stuff. Let's make him do illegal stuff so we can arrest him and put him into prison. So what they do when they find someone like that is to entrap him, provide him with an operational plan, give him weapons, and make him push the button. Those are, starkly speaking, the two choices that are the instruments that are available to us right now. I don't think that's a very good menu of options that we have right now. I do think this is the way to deal with homegrown terrorism. It's actually, in many ways, very counterproductive. Both options are very counterproductive. In fact, the person that I was talking about was someone called Mohammed Mohamud, that you may be familiar with. It is the person who, in fact, tried to blow up the Christmas lighting in Portland, Oregon at the end of last year. This is actually what happened to him. A 19-year-old guy who was pretty much like the person I just described. He was an internet jihadist. And to their credit, his parents at some point picked up on it. And not only did they pick up on it, which is already pretty good, they actually reported him to the FBI. Imagine that. Your parents pick up that you're doing bad stuff on your computer, and your own parents report you to the FBI. They couldn't have been better citizens of this country, reporting their own son to the police because they thought he was a danger to this country. What happened? The FBI said, great, let's set up a sting. let's entrap this young guy and make him do something he might never have considered doing, might never have been able to do, and send him to prison for 30 years. And that, of course, is what happened. Is that really a satisfactory outcome? Is that really all we can do? Actually, what kind of message does that send to communities? What kind of message does that send to parents? You know, would you report your son to the police if you knew that there's a good chance he will be entrapped and sent to prison for 30 years? Clearly, there must be other things we can do, and that's where the third option comes in, and that's the counter-rad option. To stick with this particular case, a good counter-rad program just about, maybe, might have increased the chances of preventing this from happening. We still don't know enough about what exactly got Mohammed radicalized. With young Somalis, there often is a confusion about identity. There's a good deal of socioeconomic deprivation. There's lack of opportunities, and maybe capacity building and general prevention would have softened the blow of that. Maybe counter-rad could have created awareness, educated members of the community what's going on. We as Al-Qaeda geeks, we always seem to assume that every Muslim knows about Anwar al-Awlaki and about jihadist ideology. Muslim parents are often as confused about that as my parents would be. And therefore, education and awareness raising is very important because they might have picked up on it much earlier. And that would have been a second step at which an intervention could have taken place. And then, of course, at the point where they called the FBI, counter-rad could have provided support rather than entrapment. In Britain, for example, you have the so-called Channel program, which provides community interventions in cases just like Mohammed's. Communities come together with the government, provide support, psychological support, socioeconomic support, a theological challenge that might prevent someone like Mohammed from going down that road. All these options that I just described, I think, would have been preferable to the FBI entrapment options. None of these options currently exist. And I very much hope that over the course of next years, we can start developing them, because it would actually, in the sense of what Karen talked about, provide us with a more honest account of the number of terrorists in this country. Thank you very much.
This should disappear, I think.
Good afternoon. Is this on? My name is Juliette Kayyem. I want to thank Peter for inviting me here. I recently left the Obama administration and the Department of Homeland Security, and wanted to give my reflections 10 years later of 9/11. I was just thinking, I am taping a segment for Nickelodeon. Any of you with kids know Nickelodeon News on 10 years later, which I'm hoping this discussion will be more elevated than that, but less opaque than my government talking points. So here we go. I have spent the last 5 years in Homeland Security, so more on the counterterrorism side than the terrorism analysis side, and essentially the rough and tumble politics of state and local government, as well as the federal government. My role at the Department of Homeland Security was working with, as the term intergovernmental will apply, essentially the homeland. And I think that's what makes counterterrorism policies within the United States so interesting, difficult, and varied, because it's just simply not monolithic. The best example I can give you is just to simply look at Massport and where Logan Airport is, which of course has a tremendous history as regards September 11th. If you are driving up to Logan Airport, you are essentially on highway facilities that are governed security-wise by the state police. The state police report up through a state public safety apparatus, which I oversaw, that then report up to the governor. If you are coming from state streets and more city streets in Boston, the security apparatus is run by the Boston police, who then report to the police commissioner and, of course, then to Mayor Menino. Once you get there, there is an intricate interplay cooperation, certainly between these two security apparatuses, which would govern, say, if you are going to Logan, which would then govern you walking up, getting your ticket, and then, of course, once you get to the security arena, then it falls over to TSA, which reports up through the Department of Homeland Security to Secretary Napolitano, and then, of course, President Obama. So you can just imagine, and that's just one airport, you can just imagine the interplay of local, state, territorial, tribal, and then, of course, federal in securing the homeland. And I just say that because I think a lot of times, I certainly discovered this at the department, a lot of times we tend to view a lot of this as federal. It certainly is not. We are a small piece of what we came to describe, and this Secretary and administration came to describe as the Homeland Security Enterprise, which I will talk to at the end. But I think it's just very important to sort of lay that out at the beginning. The second thing I wanted to just remind folks is that for a lot of us in counterterrorism, we're just consumers of intelligence. I'm not that I'm not interested, but I just want to be a consumer. There's just simply too much information out there. I think Bruce talked about just the overwhelming amount of information and threats. But what that means is we're sort of entirely dependent on a very good intelligence community, which I think there are just a lot of tremendous work going on there, but we are simply just receiving it. So if you wonder why is someone doing something, or why is there an apparatus that looks that way, it is because the intelligence is certainly driving it that way. It's the way it ought to be, but in terms of counterterrorism, just even given some of the debates that have been going on here, you can imagine how difficult it is, say, for the police chief in Dubuque, where I don't know what city the dentist was in, but wherever we talk about. So let me just talk about, I think, 3 overarching changes or themes in the last 10 years in Homeland Security. So one is money, money, money. My husband used to joke to me, for those of us in the academy on 9/11, that essentially anyone who wasn't in the terrorism field couldn't get a lot of support. Bruce alluded to this as well. Over the 10 years, that's certainly not true. The world, rightfully, and the United States have moved on. And that is just playing out on the state and local field in ways that are just tremendously apparent in the fiscal debates going on in each state house and in each city. So just imagine if you're a governor or a mayor and you are looking at rising crime and your inability to educate children in the urban area, or you're looking at healthcare costs, or you're looking at state employee retirement funds, whatever the debate is going to be of the moment, you are not talking, thinking, or probably even prioritizing, Democrat or Republican, I really have to focus my state or local apparatus on Homeland Security. That is one of the great consequences of there being essentially no successful attack on U.S. soil. It is just out there. So it is just not part of the debate in the homeland. Certainly it is in a room like this, and it is in the national security community in the federal government, but it's just the dynamic is just so different once you get out into the homeland, so to speak. Secondly, the narrative. I think it's really important to remember that there is only one governor who was governor on 9/11 still in office. That is Governor Perry from Texas. So you can just imagine, and then that's just sort of replayed in every city as well. That is not true of the national security apparatus on the federal side. Most people who are in it are, crossing the partisan politics. They are staying in Bush and in Obama. The people you've heard from, those of us tend to change. We're the Christmas help, as I like to say. But the people who've been there 20, 30 years doing intel, it doesn't matter it matters who the president is, but those aren't going to have sort of insignificant changes on their day-to-day. The narrative in political culture has just changed, and it's not Democratic or Republican. It's just simply who was in place at the time of September 11th. And so when you think about these governors and mayors who are all new, that's just not a part of their sort of governance history. And I think that's just important to remember as we approach the anniversary. It's just that is just a very different feel than it was, I think, certainly at the end of the Bush administration, but certainly in the early years after September 11th. something to just note as we are coming to that anniversary. Third, I think while everything is political, I do believe that, having dealt with state and local politics, I think we shouldn't look at it as just Democrat or Republican, but politics in the sort of intergovernmental elected politics sense. And that has made changes to the Homeland Security apparatus and to counterterrorism more difficult, I think, over time. I think for the Bush administration, when it wanted to self-correct, and certainly for the Obama administration, which came in with different viewpoints about certain things. So I think a perfect example is the color code system. I mean, I think by the end of the administration, Bush administration, they had essentially stopped using it. We certainly came in thinking it was not a helpful tool. The Secretary Napolitano has led a change in the interagency to get better about how we're informing the public what are you supposed to do. Nonetheless, it took a while, even coming into essentially 18 months since we came in into office, to change that system. And I think the reason why, or one of the reasons why, is not just the federal interagency, but the amount of dependency that had gone on with the color code system out in the field on the state and local. I mean, you can just imagine every state, every city, urban police department was triggered to the color alert system. Grants were triggered to the color alert system. Ways that airports were thinking about security. So it didn't just matter that there was a color, but that actually corresponded with how many people were out in the field. There was just an entire apparatus that was tied to, and political apparatus that was tied to color code. I think another perfect example is the challenges, and I'm a lawyer, but I don't practice anymore, so I just want to talk about the politics of Gitmo. I think some of the changes that the administration wanted to do regarding whether they were trials in New York or bringing the detainees onto U.S. soil are confounded not only by federal politics, but obviously you just have to remember by local politics. These are when you say I want to bring detainees to the United States, you're not bringing them to the United States. You're bringing them to a state and with a governor and to a jurisdiction with a mayor or a county commissioner or whatever it's going to be. And those are just, I think, multiplied because we're dealing with the Homeland. So I want to leave time for question and answer. Let me just go through a few things that I think are challenges and changes as we approach the 10-year anniversary. I think, and be interesting to hear one is, I think intelligence sharing with state and locals is still incredibly hard. The Bush administration tried to begin to bring down and share intelligence. We continued to do that in the Obama administration through a number of programs, the fusion centers, whatever else, to share information. But for the most part, the intelligence that's being shared is just still very difficult to make actionable. What are we supposed to do with it? And so you just have a lot of intelligence and information being shared, but I think that is a challenge that is sort of a primary or is a priority of Secretary Napolitano. Just change. She was a governor to change in terms of our orientation. I'm not going to get into CVA because I think your points were exactly right. It's very difficult in a democracy to find that space between the FBI and leaving everyone alone. I think it is just very difficult, and look forward to some of the recommendations that come out of it, because I think the government has a lot to learn from people who are out in the field doing that. On resiliency, I actually think this is a good news story. I don't know why it's a good news story, because I actually think both after September 11th and Hurricane Katrina, and I think we might add the BP oil spill, maybe corporate boards are having more to do with private industry getting serious about resiliency than maybe anything the government said, but it doesn't matter who's driving it. I think it's good news. And I think our capacity to get back to normal is something that the government is very focused on, or supporting the private sector. More can be done, certainly, but I think that is a much better story. And that gets to my fourth point, which is the Homeland Security enterprise, or my fourth and last point, and the sort of tone of Homeland Security and counterterrorism 10 years later. Because I think when you talk about terrorism and al-Qaeda, you have to talk about how is the U.S. and responding, and how is the public responding. Someone said in the earlier panel, and this is absolutely true, and until you enter government, you don't really know it, the zero tolerance for mistake. And it's not the 1% rule or anything. It is literally how unforgiving people are, or how unforgiving it seems when you're in government about the potential that there could be terrorism or a terrorist attack. Now, rational people out in the real world, I think, are much more adult about this and actually recognize that that there are bad things in the world, and they can come from Mother Nature or from private industry or from a bad terrorist. But I think that zero tolerance sort of still animates the post 9/11 environment. And I think if there's anything that we should look at is sort of the tone about how our leadership talks about counterterrorism, the terrorist threat, and homeland security, not as simply as it applies to the Islamic community, but I think writ large. I think one of the successes, and I know there's criticisms on this panel and others about how far this administration has taken certain things. I think one of the major pluses is given the number of real terrorist attacks in this administration, that the tone is just simply not fear all the time. It is not to make you fearful. It is not to make the American public fearful. I think that is a conscious decision and something that we should think about being able to sort of explore that dialogue as well. It's just there have been real and almost successful terrorist attacks over the course of the last nearly 18 or 19 months, and how we talk about them and sort of keeping our head on straight and getting other political leadership on state and local side to sort of talk in the same way is going to be, I think, hopefully a long-term legacy as we enter the 10th anniversary. So thank you very much.
Now, Barry and Lynn.
Well, thank you, Patrick. And my job today, I guess, is to deliver some of the not so good news. Juliette mentioned just mentioned the word resiliency and said that there is some good news in government, that systems have been made somewhat more resilient. And what I do is I look at resiliency within the private sector, within the industrial system, and frankly, it's there has not been very much progress over the last 10 years. In fact, we're going in the opposite direction. What I wanted to start with is this sort of slide that gives you a picture of two ships, and sort of just talk very briefly about how these two ships were constructed to give you a sense about sort of how our industrial system is now constructed. And the first ship is a ship that's called the Great Eastern, and this is a ship that was launched in 1858. This was the first ship that was said to be unsinkable. And this ship was designed by an engineer, a very famous engineer in England named Isambard Kingdom Brunel. Now, this is the guy who made these amazing railroads and these amazing bridges and these buildings made out of iron. And he also then one day turned his attention to ships, and he built this ship so that nothing would ever knock it down. And what he built into it was a double hull. He built in 3 modes of power. He built in a stem to stern bulkhead deck, and he built in 14 compartments. And then what happened is in 1862, 4 years after it was launched, this ship hit a rock off of Montauk Point. That rock ripped a hole in this ship that was 9 feet wide and 83 feet long. But because they had the compartments, they managed to keep the ship afloat. They got it into port. They fixed it. It spent the next 45 years sailing back and forth across the sea, mainly laying cable. The other ship you may recognize is the Titanic, which was launched 50 years after the Great Eastern hit that rock. Now, the Titanic was also said to be unsinkable. But the White Star Line, when they were having the ship designed, they had a few things left out. They wanted the ship to be maybe a little bit more efficient. I don't know if they wanted to lower prices or raise their profits. But we do know that they left out a few things. They left out the two of the modes of transportation, not so important. They left out some lifeboats, as we learned afterwards. They also left out this thing called the bulkhead deck. So what happened is, when Ballard and those people got to the bottom of the sea and they were looking at this ship, there'd been this story that there was a 300-foot-long gash in the side of the Titanic. Turned out not to be true. They found these little slits in the front of the Titanic, 6 little slits. The total amount of space that had been open to the sea was about 12 square feet. Less than 1/50th the amount of space that had been opened with the Great Eastern. What happened is that because there was no bulkhead deck, once the water got to the top of the first compartment, it spilled into the second compartment. And then when it got to the second compartment, top of the second compartment, spilled into the third, ship went straight down in about 2 hours. Now the difference between these two ships, the first ship, because of the compartmentalization, when there is a blow to the ship, when there's a disaster, you're able to isolate that disaster. You're able to isolate the problem. You're able to localize it. Second ship, because there was no ability to isolate it, when there's disaster in one place, you have that disaster every place. Within the system that is a ship, it's a global disaster. It's essentially bad engineering. So now I want to sort of take you through a couple of things that we have sort of witnessed from this recent earthquake in Japan. We saw a loss of capacity, access to capacity in the northeastern coast of Japan. What are some of the things we've seen? Just like in the automotive industry, Toyota in Japan was shut down completely for 5 weeks. Now Toyota in Japan is operating again, but Toyota globally, the entire system, North America, Europe, throughout Asia, it's operating at less than 30% capacity. And they don't know when they're going back up. They're saying maybe by November, December, that they'll be up to full capacity, maybe. Honda is actually probably in worse shape than Toyota. Nissan is almost as bad. Ford, just this week, they shut down operations in Taiwan, South Africa, India, Philippines. We're talking 6 weeks after this earthquake. We've also seen disruptions at GM, Chrysler, Volvo, Fiat, Peugeot. We've also seen disruptions in the GE production lines for aircraft engines. There's been disruptions for iPads, smartphones, appliances, cameras, motorcycle repair parts. A lot of this disruption is hidden. We see it mainly in the form of higher cost. If you go out to buy a car this summer, it's going to cost more. Fewer cars will be sold. If you go to rent a car, and certainly in Europe, the price is already up 30%. Financially, the financial sort of impact, Bank of Japan came out this week and said, the Japanese economy is shrinking. The IMF said that this event, we're talking 6 weeks out before they realize this, the Asian growth is threatened by this event because of the lack of FDI that's going to be coming out of foreign direct investment coming out of Japan. Goldman Sachs said that this event probably is going to knock about 1 percentage point off U.S. GDP this year, up to a point, between 0.5% and 1%. Now, this is going to be a robust year of growth, so we're probably not going to see that. But that, if this had been last year, that was a lot of potential growth that we're not going to see. And we have to remember that we were lucky. This event was, no matter how bad it was, it could have been vastly worse. One of the top managers of GM came out after the event just last week, and he said it is an absolute miracle that we did not see a catastrophic shutdown of the entire system. So why did this happen? Well, one of the things that we have found that have been revealed to us since this event is that single companies in northeastern Japan and single sites, just for instance, 60% of a key semiconductor resin of the global capacity, one site in the world. 60% of a sensor that's used to control the airflow in automobile engines. 90% of the copper foil used in lithium batteries. 40% of the microprocessors used to control transmissions and brakes. These are global percentages, and they're in one factory, one site, in one place in the world. Japanese companies in every one of these cases, and in many more, they control 100% of the world's supply within the borders of Japan. So we have all of these essentially, in engineering, they call them single points of failure. We can also look at them as sort of keystones in these, archways. And when you pull out these keystone components, the entire system crashes. So, what we have is that we can see is that with our global industrial system, there's a number of cases in which there's absolutely, essentially no compartmentalization. The system is not resilient. The system is extremely rigid. It is extremely brittle. A disaster in one place is transmitted throughout the system almost instantaneously. It can easily become a disaster every place. And some of these disasters we can imagine being extremely destructive. So, one of the things we should understand is this is a new phenomena. The first industrial crash, that's what these are industrial crashes. We didn't see any industrial crashes until 1999. The first one happened after an earthquake in Taiwan knocked out the shipment of components of semiconductors from a town outside of Taipei to the rest of the world. Within a few days, all of these factories all around the world shut down. We saw industrial crashes after September 11. We saw an incipient crash during the SARS event, during the West Coast port lockout. There was 4 years ago in Japan, there was a smaller earthquake, knocked out one factory. We saw all 12 of the vehicle manufacturers shut down. The Lehman event, the Lehman shock of September 2008 knocked out both the supply of credit to the system, and it also knocked out a lot of demand within the system, and we saw a number of disruptions in the industrial system after that. Other danger zones, pretty much any place where you see extreme concentration of capacity. In the south of Japan, much greater concentration of industrial capacity than the north. Had an event even quite a bit less severe than this happened in the South Japan, the disruptions would have been probably worse. Korea, you got 80% of memory chips are made in Seoul or around Seoul. And this is the global supply of memory chips. Something happens with North Korea, you're going to lose access to those memory chips. India, a number of companies do close to 100% of their back office work. U.S. companies do their back office work in South India. You lose access to India, you lose access to that back office work. Those are companies like GE. Those are companies like Citibank. Those are companies you don't want to lose access to. Taiwan, in the 12 years since that earthquake, there's been no change in in the distribution of that capacity that we lost access to in the earthquake. China, we're talking 80+% of the assembly of electronics takes place in China. Drugs in this country, 80+% of the raw materials that go into the drug supply of the United States come out of China. The ascorbic acid that we use to preserve our foods in this country, all the foods on all the store shelves, ascorbic acid. Vitamin C, this is something that was first synthesized by an American scientist. It was first mass-produced by an American company. 100% now comes from China. You lose access to, for any reason, to supply of China, you're going to have disruptions, perhaps severe, within the supply of food. So we live in a world, in other words, in which a natural disaster can trigger significant, perhaps catastrophic disruptions within the industrial system. We could see it because of a pandemic. We could see a disruption because of a financial disaster. Also, we can see disruptions because of unintentional political actions. If there were a spat between the United States and China, there could be disruptions in the trade system, even way before we ever went to war with China, and those disruptions could cause severe disruptions to the larger systems. If the Chinese people rise up again, Tiananmen 2 tomorrow, we just saw a strike within the port last week among the truckers. They rise up, not in China, they rise up in the midst of our industrial system, the one that we rely on here to provide us with our basic foods and drugs and goods. India, Pakistan happens in the middle of our economy. And of course, you've got intentional political events that are designed specifically to disrupt the supply of goods, such as we saw it last year with China in the case of rare earths. They cut off rare earths, they embargoed it for a political, to coerce Japan politically. And then we get to what you guys deal with, which is terror. If the FedEx, the printer cartridge event last October, if that's a case in which you actually see these people using the systems that we also rely on for the transportation of all these vital components. This is kind of a fantastic story, the fact that we have an industrial system that is quite radically different than what we think it is, and it's radically different than the way it used to be. So, just very briefly, how did this come to be? 15 years ago, the fact is that if there was an earthquake like what we saw in Japan last week, we would have lost Toyota or Honda or General Motors. What we saw now is that we lost Toyota and General Motors and Honda. The reason this is that because 20 years ago, the reason it didn't happen or would not have happened is because the system was doubly compartmentalized. It was compartmentalized within self-sufficient nation states and within self-sufficient industrial corporations, vertically integrated corporations. Since then, over the last 15 years, we've seen what we call globalization, or sometimes we call it offshoring. And this is essentially this blending together of industrial systems. We now share an industrial system with all of these other nations. Some nations do A, other nations do B. We have to connect A, B, C, D, and E to have the products that we use. And then outsourcing is the other revolution. That's the disintegration of the vertically integrated firm. And what we've seen there is all of these firms that used to do everything themselves now share many of their supply activities. Now, it's important, though, is like neither globalization nor outsourcing, nor the disintegration of the vertically integrated firm leads to this kind of concentration or this kind of risk. On the contrary, both globalization and outsourcing should, in theory, lead to greater distribution of capacity, greater distribution of risk. What actually resulted in this kind of concentration was another factor, one that we don't talk about very much. It was the abandonment of our anti-monopoly enforcement back in the 1980s in this country. It was the abandonment of our anti-mercantilist activity at the federal level using trade policy back in the 1990s. What we did is we left a number of people free to concentrate power. That's what they seek to do. In the process, they've also concentrated capacity, and hence they've concentrated risk. Now, there's political reasons that went behind this, but the fact is that, for our purposes today, two key facts stand out. One, the system that you guys are protecting is improperly engineered. And I've had one of the top guys at Motorola some years ago, back when Motorola was a great manufacturer, said, "We have broken all the rules of engineering." And then the second thing is almost no one that that really understands this. No one in Washington understands this. None of the public officials, very few of the economists have any inkling of this. There was, and I just, to wrap up here, last year, for the first time, WTO, an economist at WTO wrote an article in a World Bank publication, and this was after the panic of 2008. And this is the first sign that these guys are picking up on this. And he wrote, "Global production networks have introduced new microeconomic dimensions that run parallel to the traditional macroeconomic mechanism of shock transmission. If a shock occurs in one of the participating sectors or countries, the shock is transmitted quickly to the other stages of the supply chain through both backward and forward linkages. These production networks have an inherent magnification effect on shocks." That's a good start. But it's only a start, and I'll leave you with this, which is the fact that this knowledge remains extremely isolated. For instance, last week, the Federal Reserve's trying to figure out what's going on with this, with the economy. This is one of the headlines you might have seen last week, which was impact of Japan's quake on U.S. factories surprises Fed. So again, it's like this is something that is not well understood, and so the stakes that are at play here are quite a bit larger than most people realize.
Great. I love how Barry can make all of us look like the optimist, as Karen just said. Thank you, everyone. This is a great panel, extraordinarily diverse, looking at, I think, what is a broad range of concerns and issues on the domestic in the domestic theater. What I want to do is quickly turn over to questions and answers for the floor, so that we can get a little bit more discussion in on this session. And then I've been instructed that at 12:10 we're going to call it quits and shift to lunch, and I'll give you some instructions at that point. So if our microphones are ready, all the way in the back would be great. And if you can wait for the microphone to come and then state your name, that'd be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
My name's Eric Emler. I'm with Drug Enforcement Administration, and my question is at first specific to Ms. Greenberg and her database she spoke about, but then maybe in general terms when I talk about some of these examples. I was going to ask you is does your database track all terrorism-related investigations, or just those that are specific direct plots to the United States? Because I want to point out successful prosecutions like that against Mansour al-Qassar, pending prosecution against Victor Bout, as well as a successful arrest for Title 21 U.S. 960A against members of the AQIM, and how these factor into your analysis and the bigger picture. And then also, from our perspective, people like Mansour al-Qassar, Victor Bout, those individuals who, from the earlier panel, members of Al-Qaeda aren't necessarily, nuclear chemists or nuclear physicists or anything, but individuals like these who have the access to maybe get larger scale WMD in the hands of those people who want to use them to kill Americans. And also to point out specifically that with Mansour al-Qassar's successful conviction, Title 18, conspiracy to kill Americans. So I just wanted to get your thoughts specifically, and anybody else who cares to address that.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, a really good question, which, these are the kinds of questions we debate all day long. And Susan Quattrone is in the back, and you can hit her up later for how we make these decisions. But, I'm glad you raised that. The way these get into the database is 99% by the U.S. government willing to expand the category of terrorism to include these. That's basically how I go about it. So I don't think Victor Bout is there, but Mansour al-Assad is, and most of them are, but you'd have to check with Susan. But here's what I want to say about it. You've raised a really interesting point. But one of the reasons that we keep making these divisions, like, well, these are jihadi crimes, and these are FARC crimes, and these are, whatever kind of drug crime, is that there is a large portion of the database separate from the data that I was giving you that are drug crimes or sometimes criminal conspiracy crimes that involve some of the same charges of terrorism, and yes, they are in there. What's even more interesting about this is that, and this is just a sort of a footnote, but in terms of bringing these trials in the United States, the drug enforcement, the DA crimes use a different method of getting information, and I think you kind of know this in terms of who they have on the ground, how they get the forensics, and it fundamentally changes the way these cases are argued in court. And so one of the things we've been looking into is, how to sort of broker that conversation to take some of the techniques that are used in these other cases that you're talking, particularly drug investigations, and to use that understanding of the international evidentiary environment to bring it over, in a sense, to terrorism cases. So in other words, Susan and I would both like to talk to you, and thank you for your question.
Thanks. Okay, next question. Gentleman there with the lanyard around his neck. There we go. Thanks.
Yeah, Bill Pope, retired Foreign Service, formerly in the Office of the Coordinator for Counterterrorism at the State Department. One of the most discouraging aspects of where we are right now, 10 years later, is the psyche of the American public. It was referred to in the first panel. It could have easily been asked of them. It referred to again here about zero tolerance, about fear, about lack of resiliency, even though in the psychological sense. And I'm just wondering, wanted to ask Assistant Secretary Kayyem about this. Al-Qaeda claiming that even though the underwear bomber failed and many of these others failed, they were still real successes for them because we freaked, we panicked, we took all these steps. Let's throw another $1 trillion at something. Is there anything we can do? The president, the bully pulpit, the Congress, the media, anything anyone can do to begin to get us out of this, and more like the way the Israelis do it. A bus gets bombed and the people sweep up, bury the dead, and the next day the people are back at the same bus stop to take the bus again. Is there anything we can do to become, as a nation, more psychologically resilient? Thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, it's a great question, and I'll just maybe answer it with some other questions, because it is terribly ironic that a nation as big as ours and as populated as ours, which has relatively few casualties over the last decade related to terrorism, is, as you point out, the one most likely to react in that, in that sort of zero tolerance, big, bad, lots of money way than nations that are dealing with it every day. Or maybe it's not ironic, maybe that's because we just had no idea of, I think people were just so surprised by September 11th, not just because of its size, but because most people didn't even know what Al-Qaeda was or bin Laden was. I think I think it is predominantly, I can, bash the media and and it's not just federal media. I mean, it's literally, if you guys see local news, I mean, it's crazy. Oh, I got a pen and a knife onto the airport. These are the big stories. These will be the stories around 9/11, trust me, around the anniversary of 9/11. These will be tremendous stories about reporters sneaking on various materials that could have killed the pilot and everyone else. But I think it is the bully pulpit is really the only, the bully pulpit from the president on down. I think he has been successful in that regard. I think you don't see this breathlessness coming from the White House or from the department after every attack. It's going to take, or attempted attack, it's going to take many years. And goodness knows if there's a successful one, what the dialogue will be like. And then, of course, it's, and then it's the leadership on down to the state and local side. And then I just think the American public has just got to, and I'll be blunt, it's just got to grow up about this. I don't mean to, this is not, just given the evidence in the first panel, this is not an existential threat. This is a bad threat. It could get worse. We've done tremendous work. But I could give you a long list of things that I'm more worried about for myself and certainly my kids than I am about this. And we just have to figure out a way in which we educate each other about this. And I will say, just, you can talk to a room full of terrorism experts like all of you. I'm on the, as I said, the consumer end of this. And you all are really smart and think about this and about terrorists. But then you ask the question, if there was an earthquake in your town, could you and your family survive for 72 hours, which is much more likely to happen if you're from California or a hurricane in New England. And the number of people who can't answer yes is shocking. So part of it is us growing up, too, and just being, stuff happens.
Great. Anyone else want to take a crack? All right, next question. In the blue, coming from behind you there. Great.
My name is Bernard Moore. I'm from the United States Special Operations Command, but don't represent them for the purpose of this question. And the question is aimed at Peter specifically. To what degree do you think a possibly aggressive United States foreign policy over the last 25 years in the Middle East has been a taboo subject or sacred cow not touched in the idea of a way of approaching counter-radicalization? In other words, getting to the core of some of the radicalization might just happen to be perhaps U.S. policies, which seem to be to others in the Middle East rather assertive.
Well, I answer that question maybe 1,000 times in Britain. It's always the first question that comes up. To what extent is foreign policy the reason for all of this? And the conventional wisdom used to be that it is. I'm slightly less convinced, not that I reject the idea that foreign policy is an important factor in this. I think the factor is the narrative and how foreign policy fits in. The narrative is the West at war with Islam, and anything that seems to confirm that narrative actually bolsters the attraction of the ideology. And so if, for example, the US does something like invading Iraq, for example, that feeds into that narrative, that will be used in order to exploit people, in order to radicalize and recruit people. So all these things feature. But similarly, it can be domestic things that can also be fashioned in order to fit that narrative. So the foreign policy is a function of the narrative rather than the other way around. Foreign policy itself, I don't believe, causes people to be radicalized. And what I've been most astonished by, and what no expert has given me a good answer to, is why we saw such an enormous amount of obvious radicalization around the Iraq War in 2003 in Europe, but not in the country that was leading that invasion, namely the United States. And I still haven't got a full answer to that, and I'm still getting to the ground. And if I find an answer, I'll let you know. Thank you.
And if, to follow on that, to what extent is economic prospects, and we talked about these Somali kids whose economic future is not looking all that bright necessarily, new immigrants who are struggling, to what extent do we see economic conditions playing a role as well in the radicalization process? Well,
again, I mean, it's been said 1,000 times by people that have studied this much more than I have, that poverty is not directly related to people participating in terrorism. However, it's very important to understand that an important component of the radicalization cycle is some kind of grievance, some kind of externally caused tension that people perceive, and that creates a cognitive opening, that creates a vacuum that will be filled by an ideology, and that perhaps then will be mobilized by a terrorist group into action. So grievance is an important component. It's not sufficient, but it is necessary for someone to become radical. The perception of socioeconomic exclusion can be a grievance that plays a role. And it's certainly true that whilst overall American Muslims are earning a lot of money, are highly educated, there are pockets of socioeconomic exclusion, and the Somali community in this country is one such pocket. And the Somali community in this country is actually quite similar to many European Muslim communities that are similarly deprived and similarly ghettoized. And I think for that particular community, measures that are aimed at capacity building, building youth centers, creating economic opportunities for people, could actually help reduce the risk of people experiencing those cognitive openings.
Great, thank you. More questions from the field? Okay, with that, I will not stand between you and lunch. Please help me thank our panel for a great presentation.